Welcome back to the channel, where we explore the darkest horror stories, abandoned places, terrifying urban legends, and mysteries that continue to haunt those who survive them. If you enjoy stories that make you question what is real and what waits in the darkness, you're in the right place. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let yourself disappear into tonight's nightmare. This story is called Don't Look into the Mine Shaft. For generations, the people of West Virginia had avoided an abandoned coal mine known as Black Hollow. It had been closed since 1948 after a catastrophic collapse claimed dozens of miners' lives. Official reports blamed unstable rock formations and poisonous gases, but the local residents never believed that was the whole truth. They spoke quietly about the mine, and only during daylight. Once the sun disappeared behind the Appalachian Mountains, nobody dared walk the old logging road leading to its entrance. Parents warned their children never to wander into the forest, hunters refused to cross the nearby hills after dusk, and anyone curious enough to ask why always received the same unsettling answer. Never look into the mine shaft after dark. No explanation ever followed. The warning simply existed, passed from one generation to the next like a sacred rule nobody was willing to break. In October of 2024, 5 teenagers decided that the stories were nothing more than superstition. Ethan Carter, an 18-year-old amateur filmmaker, had recently started uploading videos about abandoned places to his small YouTube channel. Although he dreamed of becoming a successful content creator, most of his videos attracted only a handful of viewers. When he discovered an online discussion mentioning Black Hollow Mine, he became convinced that exploring it would finally produce the kind of content capable of changing everything. His closest friends agreed to accompany him, though not everyone shared his excitement. Maya had always been skeptical of ghost stories but hated taking unnecessary risks. Lucas laughed at anything supernatural and treated every legend like an opportunity for a joke. Noah loved photography and cared more about capturing dramatic images than investigating haunted places. Emily, however, felt uneasy from the moment they accepted Ethan's invitation. She couldn't explain why, but something about the abandoned mine made her uncomfortable long before they ever arrived. The drive through the mountains became increasingly strange as daylight faded into evening. Thick gray clouds covered the sky, swallowing the last traces of sunlight. 20 minutes before reaching their destination, every phone inside the car suddenly lost its signal. Ethan assumed the mountains were blocking the towers, but Emily noticed something even stranger. The forest surrounding the narrow road had become completely silent. There were no birds singing, no insects buzzing, and no wind moving through the trees. Even with the windows slightly open, the air carried an unnatural stillness that seemed almost impossible. "This place feels wrong," Emily whispered quietly, staring into the endless wall of trees beside the road. Lucas laughed without looking up from his phone. "You're letting ghost stories get into your head." "I'm serious," she replied. "Listen." The others fell silent for a moment. Nothing. No birds. No crickets. No rustling leaves. Only the tires rolling across the wet pavement. For reasons none of them could explain, nobody laughed after that. Several minutes later, the rusted entrance to Black Hollow Mine emerged from the darkness. Massive steel gates leaned sideways beneath thick vines, while abandoned buildings slowly disappeared beneath decades of neglect. A weathered wooden sign still stood near the entrance, barely held together by rotten posts. Most of the paint had faded away, but the words Black Hollow Coal Company, established 1919, closed 1948 remained barely readable. Below those faded letters was another message painted in bright white. "Do not look into the shaft." Unlike the original sign, the warning appeared surprisingly fresh, as though someone had repainted it only weeks earlier. Lucas smirked. "Someone really wants tourists to stay away." Maya frowned. "Who would come all the way out here just to repaint a warning sign?" Nobody answered. They stepped beyond the broken gate and entered the abandoned mining complex. Rusted machinery rested exactly where workers had abandoned it nearly 80 years earlier. Every surface was coated in black coal dust, and each footstep released small clouds into the cold air. The deeper they walked, the colder everything became. It wasn't the ordinary chill of autumn. This cold felt heavy, almost alive, wrapping around them with every step. Then Emily suddenly stopped walking. "Did you hear that?" Everyone froze. For several long seconds, absolute silence surrounded them. Then they heard it. Very faint. A woman crying. The sound drifted through the abandoned buildings from somewhere underground. It wasn't loud enough to identify immediately, yet it carried unmistakable sorrow. Whoever it was sounded exhausted, hopeless, and completely alone. The crying echoed softly between the broken structures before disappearing into the surrounding darkness. Lucas looked toward the old tunnel entrance. Someone's down there. Noah shook his head immediately. That's impossible. This place has been abandoned for decades. The crying came again. This time it sounded closer. Longer. Clearer. Maya instinctively reached for her phone before remembering there was still no signal. "We should call for help," she whispered. Ethan, meanwhile, had already raised his camera. "If someone really is trapped down there, we can't just leave." Without waiting for another opinion, he switched on his flashlight and entered the tunnel leading into Black Hollow Mine. The others reluctantly followed. The air inside felt colder than outside. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling, echoing endlessly through the narrow passage. Ancient wooden support beams groaned beneath the weight of the mountain above them, and every sound they made seemed to travel impossibly far into the darkness ahead. After nearly 15 minutes of walking, the tunnel suddenly opened into an enormous underground chamber. In the center of the room lay the main mine shaft. It was perfectly circular, stretching nearly 30 feet across, disappearing straight into absolute darkness. There were no safety rails or warning barriers remaining. Only a massive hole descending deeper than any of their flashlight beams could reach. Looking at it felt strangely unsettling, as though the earth itself had opened an endless mouth beneath their feet. The crying became louder. There was no longer any doubt. Someone was below them. Lucas cautiously stepped toward the edge. "Hello," he called. Only crying answered him. He tried again, louder this time. "Can you hear us?" For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, barely louder than a whisper, a voice drifted upward. "So cold." Every one of them heard it. It sounded like a woman, Maya whispered. Emily instinctively grabbed Ethan's sleeve. "Don't go any closer." Ethan looked at her. "If someone's alive down there, we have to help." "The sign didn't say not to enter the mine," Emily replied, unable to hide the fear in her voice. "It specifically said not to look into the shaft." Ethan forced a nervous smile. "That's just an old legend." Slowly, he stepped closer to the edge. He raised his flashlight and pointed it directly into the darkness below. For several seconds, the beam revealed nothing except endless blackness. Then, two tiny reflections appeared far beneath them. Eyes. Someone was standing at the bottom of the shaft. The crying stopped instantly. The figure slowly lifted one arm and pointed directly toward Ethan. Then it spoke. "Ethan." His entire body froze. The voice sounded strangely familiar. The figure spoke again. "No." This time Ethan recognized it. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a woman. It was his own voice. Older. Weak. Broken. Filled with unimaginable terror. "Don't let them look down." Ethan staggered backward. "No. That's impossible." The others instinctively shined their flashlights into the shaft. What they saw stole every breath from their lungs. There weren't just one pair of eyes anymore. There were 5 figures standing together at the bottom of the mine. Each one stared silently upward. Each wore torn clothing covered in coal dust. Each looked decades older than they should have. Each carried scars that no ordinary person could survive. And every single face belonged to one of the teenagers standing above the shaft. Noah was staring at himself. Emily was staring at herself. Lucas was staring at himself. Maya was staring at herself. Ethan was staring into the exhausted, terrified eyes of his own future. For several endless seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then every figure below slowly looked up together. Their mouths opened at exactly the same moment. And in voices identical to those of the 5 teenagers standing above them, they screamed one terrifying warning that echoed through the abandoned mine. The word exploded through the enormous underground chamber, echoing so violently that it seemed to shake the very foundations of Black Hollow Mine. "Run!" The voices were unmistakable. They did not merely resemble the teenagers' voices, they were identical in every possible way. Ethan heard his own terrified voice rising from the darkness below, while Maya, Lucas, Noah, and Emily each heard themselves screaming the same desperate warning. The echoes collided with the stone walls, repeating over and over until no one could tell whether the voices were coming from the bottom of the shaft or somewhere within the tunnel surrounding them. Every heartbeat seemed louder than the last, and for several unbearable seconds, none of them dared to move. Ethan's flashlight shook violently in his trembling hand as he stared into the endless darkness. The older version of himself remained motionless at the bottom of the shaft. His face was almost unrecognizable beneath layers of coal dust and dried blood, while a deep wound stretched across his forehead and disappeared beneath tangled black hair. His clothing was torn into strips, hanging loosely from a body that looked as though it had survived years trapped beneath the earth. Yet what frightened Ethan most was not his appearance. It was his expression. The older Ethan was no longer looking at him. Instead, his terrified eyes were fixed on something standing behind the 5 teenagers. "What is happening?" Maya whispered, barely able to force the words from her throat. No one answered. Lucas tried to laugh, but the sound died before it left his lips. "This has to be some kind of prank," he muttered, though his voice carried none of its usual confidence. Noah slowly lowered his camera, unable to believe what he had just witnessed. Emily never took her eyes off the woman standing below. She looked at least 20 years older than Emily herself, yet every detail matched perfectly. The small scar above her eyebrow came from a bicycle accident when she was 9 years old. Around her neck hung the same silver necklace Emily had worn every single day since her grandmother had given it to her. It wasn't simply someone who looked like Emily. Somehow, impossibly, it was Emily herself. Then something strange happened. The older Emily stepped forward, but instead of speaking aloud, her lips moved silently. Emily instinctively leaned closer, trying to understand what she was saying. No one else reacted, as if they couldn't hear anything at all. Suddenly, the words entered Emily's mind like a whisper carried by the cold air itself. "Don't trust the voices. Whatever happens, don't answer if you hear your name." Emily's breathing caught in her throat. Before she could warn the others, the older version of herself vanished completely. She did not walk away or disappear into the darkness. One moment she was standing there, and the next she simply no longer existed. The remaining figures at the bottom of the shaft turned away from the teenagers, their terrified expressions fixed on something much deeper beneath them. Ethan followed their gaze and immediately wished he hadn't. Far below the 5 figures, beyond the reach of every flashlight, something moved. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even shaped like one. The darkness itself seemed to shift, revealing brief glimpses of impossibly long fingers and pale skin before disappearing again. Whatever it was enormous, far too large to fit inside the shaft, and yet it continued moving silently beneath them, as though waiting for the right moment to emerge. Unable to resist his curiosity, Ethan raised his flashlight slightly higher. The older version of himself looked directly into the beam of light. Terror flooded his face as he screamed with every ounce of strength he had left. "Turn off the light!" At that exact instant, every flashlight in the chamber died simultaneously. The darkness that followed was unlike anything they had ever experienced. It wasn't simply the absence of light. It felt alive. Thick. Heavy. As though the mine itself had swallowed every ray of brightness. Ethan couldn't see his own hands. None of them could. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, each drop echoing endlessly through the tunnels before fading into silence. Then they heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Crunch. 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 The sound wasn't coming from below the shaft anymore. It circled around them, as if someone, or something, was walking carefully along the edge of the pit in complete darkness. The footsteps stopped only a few feet away. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. Then a familiar voice broke the silence. "Ethan." His blood turned to ice. It was his mother. Not merely similar to her voice, but perfect in every detail. The gentle warmth, the subtle exhaustion, even the slight tremble she always had after working long hours. "Ethan, sweetheart, where are you?" she called softly from somewhere behind him. His mind raced. His mother was hundreds of miles away. She couldn't possibly be standing inside an abandoned coal mine. The voice came again, sounding even closer this time. "Please answer me." Emily remembered the warning she had received only moments earlier. "Don't answer if you hear your name." She squeezed her eyes shut and fought the urge to speak. Then another voice echoed through the darkness. Noah. It was Noah's father. Lucas heard his younger sister crying softly somewhere behind him. Maya heard her grandmother calling for help in a weak, trembling voice. Every one of them heard the person they loved most. The voices sounded frightened, desperate, and painfully real. They begged for help. They begged for answers. They pleaded with each teenager to simply say something. Noah instinctively stepped toward his father's voice before Emily grabbed his wrist with surprising force. No, she whispered urgently. But that's my dad. No, it isn't. He's hurt. Noah. The voice called again. Please. I need you. Tears filled Noah's eyes. The voice cracked exactly the way his father's always did after working 12-hour shifts. Every instinct told him it was real. Every memory insisted his father needed him. Unable to resist any longer, Noah opened his mouth. Dad? The moment the single word escaped his lips, every voice vanished. Silence filled the mine for less than a heartbeat. Then the entire mountain erupted with laughter. It wasn't human laughter. It was deeper, older, and impossibly loud. Hundreds of voices laughed together from every direction at once, vibrating through the stone beneath their feet until the ground itself began to tremble. Small rocks broke free from the ceiling and crashed onto the floor around them. Emily screamed as the laughter echoed through every tunnel. Suddenly, without warning, every flashlight switched back on. The chamber reappeared before their eyes. The future versions of themselves were gone. The bottom of the shaft was empty once again. Only endless darkness remained. But something else had changed. Fresh footprints surrounded the edge of the shaft. Bare human footprints. Each one coated in wet black coal dust. They circled the opening once before stopping only a few feet from where the teenagers stood. All 5 sets of footprints faced directly toward them, as though someone had climbed out of the shaft while they were trapped in darkness. Noah slowly counted the people standing beside him. Ethan. Maya. Lucas. Emily. Myself. He swallowed hard. There are only 5 of us. Lucas stared silently at the footprints before whispering the question none of them wanted to ask. So, whose footprints are these? No one answered. Because at the far end of the tunnel they had used to enter the mine, another flashlight suddenly flickered to life. A pale white beam pierced the darkness, revealing the silhouette of a lone figure standing perfectly still. The stranger never spoke. He simply watched them from the shadows. Then, after several agonizing seconds, he slowly took his first step toward them. The figure remained motionless for several long seconds, illuminated only by the weak beam of the flashlight hanging loosely from his hand. At first, none of the teenagers could make out his face. The distance between them and the stranger was too great, while the floating dust in the tunnel distorted the light into a pale haze. Every instinct told them to run, yet fear rooted them to the ground. The only sound inside the enormous chamber was the slow dripping of water from the ceiling, each drop echoing like the ticking of an invisible clock counting down to something terrible. Then, without warning, the stranger began walking toward them. His footsteps were unnaturally slow, dragging against the coal-covered floor with a heavy scraping sound that echoed through the abandoned mine. Unlike an ordinary person, he never hurried. He walked with absolute certainty, as though he had known they would come long before they ever entered Black Hollow Mine. As the distance between them grew shorter, Ethan finally managed to see the man's face. He appeared to be in his late 60s, although the years had been cruel to him. Deep wrinkles-covered skin stained permanently black by coal dust, while a thick gray beard concealed most of his gaunt face. He wore an old miner's helmet with a rusted carbide lamp attached to the front, though it had long since stopped working. His heavy work jacket, once bright orange, had faded into a dull brown beneath decades of dirt, and an old identification badge still hung from his chest by a broken chain. Although his clothes looked as though they belonged to another century, they were remarkably intact, almost as if he had only just stepped away from work. The most unsettling detail, however, was his eyes. They were pale, almost colorless, and carried an exhaustion unlike anything the teenagers had ever seen. It was the look of a man who had spent a lifetime staring into darkness. When he was only a few feet away, he stopped. His breathing was calm. His expression betrayed neither surprise nor fear, as though encountering 5 terrified teenagers deep inside an abandoned coal mine was perfectly ordinary. For several moments, no one spoke. Finally, Ethan gathered enough courage to break the silence. "Sir, are you okay?" The old man looked at each of them one by one before answering in a voice so quiet they almost didn't hear him. "You looked into the shaft." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. No one replied. The old man sighed deeply and lowered his head. "I told them to repaint the warning every spring," he murmured. "I hoped one day people would finally listen." Lucas exchanged a nervous glance with Noah before speaking. "Who are you?" The man remained silent for several seconds before reaching inside his jacket. Instinctively, all 5 teenagers stepped backward, expecting him to pull out a weapon. Instead, he removed a small metal identification tag covered in scratches and handed it to Ethan. After wiping away decades of grime with his sleeve, Ethan could just barely read the faded engraving. Thomas Whitaker. Mine foreman. Black Hollow Coal Company. Maya's face turned pale. "That's impossible." The old man offered a tired smile. "I've heard that many times." Emily looked at the rusted identification tag, then back at the stranger standing before them. "The mine closed in 1948, she whispered. "That was almost 80 years ago." Thomas nodded slowly. "I know." Lucas frowned. "You can't seriously expect us to believe you've been down here since then." The old man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the edge of the mine shaft and stared into the endless darkness below. His expression became painfully distant, as though he were remembering something he had spent decades trying to forget. "There were 63 of us working that day," he finally said. "It started with the crying." The chamber fell completely silent. Thomas continued speaking without taking his eyes off the shaft. "At first we thought one of the miners had fallen into the pit. We heard a woman crying from somewhere below. She kept begging for help. Some of the younger men wanted to rescue her immediately, but the older miners refused. They had heard the stories long before I became foreman. They warned everyone not to look into the shaft after sunset." His voice grew quieter. But one man ignored them. Thomas closed his eyes. He shined his carbide lamp into the darkness. The old miner's hands began trembling. He saw his own son standing at the bottom of the shaft. No one interrupted him. The boy had disappeared 6 years earlier after drowning in the Ohio River. We buried an empty coffin because his body was never found. Yet somehow, there he was. Standing at the bottom of the mine, crying for his father to help him. Emily felt her stomach tighten. "The miner climbed down?" she asked softly. Thomas nodded. "He never came back." The old foreman's voice echoed gently through the chamber as though the mine itself were listening. Then another man looked into the shaft. He saw his wife. Another saw his brother. Another saw his daughter. Every single person who looked down saw someone they loved, or themselves. He turned slowly toward the teenagers. "That's how it hunts." A cold shiver passed through Ethan's body. "What hunts?" Thomas stared at him with hollow eyes. "The thing beneath the mountain." No one spoke. Even the dripping water seemed to stop. Thomas lowered his voice until it was barely more than a whisper. "It doesn't have a face. It doesn't have a body. It borrows yours." The words settled heavily over the group. "It learns your memories," Thomas continued. "It learns your fears. It learns your voice. Then it becomes the only thing you trust." Maya suddenly remembered the voices they had heard in the darkness. "Our families." Thomas nodded. "They were never here. It wanted you to answer." Emily looked toward Noah. "You did answer." Noah's face lost all color. I only said one word." Thomas's expression darkened. "One word is enough." Silence consumed the chamber once again. Then something echoed from somewhere deep beneath the shaft. Not crying. Not laughter. Breathing. Slow. Heavy. As though something unimaginably large had just awakened. The sound rose steadily through the darkness, filling every tunnel with a deep rhythmic rumble that seemed less like breathing and more like the mountain itself drawing air into its lungs. Thomas's face turned ghostly white. For the first time since they had met him, genuine fear appeared in his eyes. Without another word, he stepped backward and whispered only 4 words. "It knows you're here." The breathing stopped. Then, from the depths of the shaft, 5 familiar voices whispered together in perfect unison. "We're coming back." The flashlight beams began to flicker violently once again. Behind the teenagers, somewhere inside the tunnel leading back to the surface, a second set of footsteps slowly echoed through the darkness. This time, there was more than one. The second set of footsteps echoed through the tunnel with a slow, deliberate rhythm, followed almost immediately by a third, then a fourth, until the sound became impossible to count. It was as though an entire group of people was walking toward the chamber in perfect synchronization. None of them spoke. None of them hurried. The only sounds were the steady scrape of boots dragging across loose coal and the faint crackling of stones beneath unseen feet. Ethan instinctively aimed his flashlight toward the tunnel, but the beam disappeared into a curtain of drifting black dust. The light illuminated only a few yards before being swallowed by darkness so thick it seemed almost solid. Whatever was approaching remained hidden beyond its reach. Thomas Whitaker's face drained of what little color remained. His tired eyes widened with a fear that could not be mistaken. He grabbed Ethan's arm with surprising strength and pulled him backward from the edge of the shaft. "Don't stand still," he whispered urgently. "When they arrive, never let them surround you." His voice no longer carried the calm exhaustion of an old man. Instead, it trembled with the panic of someone who had lived through this nightmare too many times. Ethan had dozens of questions racing through his mind, but one look at Thomas told him there wasn't enough time to ask any of them. The footsteps grew louder with every passing second until they seemed to fill the entire mine. Then, one by one, silhouettes began to emerge from the darkness. At first, the figures looked like ordinary people. Their heads were lowered, and their movements were slow and unsteady, almost as if they had wandered through the tunnels for days without rest. As they drew closer, the flashlight beams finally revealed their faces. Emily gasped so sharply that she nearly dropped her flashlight. The first figure was Noah. Or at least, it looked exactly like Noah. He wore the same gray hoodie, the same hiking boots, and even carried the same backpack slung over one shoulder. His face was identical in every detail except for one horrifying difference. His skin had become unnaturally pale, almost the color of wet ash, while his eyes reflected no light at all. They were completely black, darker than the mine itself, as though every trace of humanity had been drained from them. Behind him came another figure that looked exactly like Maya. Then another that looked like Lucas. Another that looked like Emily. Finally, the last figure stepped into the light. It was Ethan. The five doubles stopped walking at exactly the same moment. No one spoke. No one blinked. They simply stared at the teenagers with blank expressions that somehow felt far more terrifying than anger. Lucas shook his head violently. "No, no, this can't be happening." The creature wearing Lucas's face tilted its head ever so slightly, perfectly copying his movement a heartbeat later. Then all five doubles smiled together. The smiles were wrong. Far too wide. Far too still. The corners of their mouths stretched unnaturally across their faces until it seemed impossible that human skin could bend so far without tearing. Emily felt her stomach twist as she realized none of them were breathing. Their chests remained perfectly still despite standing only a few feet away. They weren't alive in any normal sense of the word. Thomas slowly backed away while keeping his eyes fixed on the copies. "Don't speak to them," he whispered. "Whatever happens, don't answer them." The figure wearing Ethan's face took one slow step forward. When it finally spoke, its voice was flawless. "We've been looking for you." Ethan felt every hair on his body stand upright. The voice was his. Not similar. Not close. Perfect. It even carried the slight rasp in his throat that always appeared after talking for too long. The copy smiled a little wider. "You shouldn't have left us down there." Maya looked toward Ethan in confusion. "What does it mean?" Before Ethan could answer, the creature wearing Maya's face spoke. "It means this is where we belong." The five doubles continued walking toward them, each step perfectly synchronized with the others. They moved without haste, yet there was something deeply unnatural about the way they advanced. Their feet touched the ground without making the slightest sound. It was as though they weren't walking at all, but gliding effortlessly across the coal-covered floor. Thomas suddenly shouted, "Close your eyes." The command startled everyone. Without hesitation, Emily squeezed her eyes shut. Maya followed immediately. Ethan hesitated for only a fraction of a second before obeying, while Lucas and Noah did the same. Darkness filled their vision, yet the footsteps continued growing closer. Then they heard something impossible. Their own voices. Each teenager could hear themselves speaking somewhere directly in front of them. Ethan, open your eyes. Maya, it's safe now. Lucas, look at me. Noah, don't be afraid. Emily, we're waiting. The voices were soft, comforting, almost loving. They sounded exactly the way each of them imagined they would speak if trying to calm a frightened child. Thomas shouted again. They can't take your face unless you look at theirs. Emily clenched her fists as tears formed beneath her closed eyelids. Every instinct urged her to look. Curiosity gnawed relentlessly at her mind. What if the voices were telling the truth? What if closing their eyes only made them more vulnerable? But then she remembered the warning whispered by the older version of herself at the bottom of the shaft. Don't trust the voices. The whispers continued. Gentle. Patient. Persistent. Seconds felt like hours. Finally, the voices stopped. The mind became silent once more. Thomas waited several more moments before speaking in an exhausted whisper. You can open your eyes now. One by one, the teenagers slowly lifted their eyelids. The chamber was empty. The doubles had vanished without leaving a single footprint behind. Only the endless darkness of the abandoned mine remained. Noah let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They're gone. Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he stared toward the far wall of the chamber. His face became pale once again. What is it? Ethan asked. The old foreman slowly raised a trembling finger toward the rock wall. The others followed his gaze. At first, they saw nothing unusual. Then Ethan's flashlight drifted across the stone surface. Fresh words had been carved into the coal-black rock. The letters looked wet, as though they had been scratched into the wall only moments earlier by sharp fingernails. There was only one sentence. You looked down. Now it looks through you. A cold silence settled over the chamber. No one moved. No one spoke. Then Noah noticed something that made his heart stop. The sentence wasn't written in coal. It was written in blood. And beneath the final word, 5 fresh handprints slowly appeared on the wall by themselves. One after another. As if invisible hands were pressing against the stone from the other side. The 5 blood-red handprints appeared one after another in complete silence, each pressing slowly against the rock as though invisible people were trapped within the mountain itself. The fresh blood glistened beneath the flashlight beams before beginning to drip downward in thin crimson streams. No one dared move. Even Lucas, who had mocked every ghost story since they had entered the mine, stood frozen with his mouth slightly open. The impossible scene before them shattered whatever remained of his skepticism. Every instinct told him to run, yet his legs refused to obey. Thomas Whitaker stared at the wall with hollow eyes. He did not look surprised. Instead, his expression carried the weary resignation of someone witnessing an old nightmare repeating itself once again. After several long moments, he lowered his head and whispered, "It has chosen you." His voice was so quiet that Ethan almost failed to hear him. Every group that comes here sees different things at first. Some hear voices. Others see people they lost. Some never make it past the entrance. But once the wall answers. He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. It never lets go. What do you mean, it never lets go? Maya asked, her voice trembling. Thomas slowly reached toward the stone wall without touching it. The mind doesn't simply haunt people, he said. It remembers them. Every person who looks into the shaft leaves something behind. A memory. A fear. A piece of themselves. The longer you remain here, the more of you it takes. Emily felt a chill spread through her body. You mean, we're trapped? Thomas hesitated before answering. I don't know. The uncertainty in his voice frightened them more than any ghost story ever could. Noah suddenly noticed something unusual about the handprints. Wait, he whispered. Look closely. Everyone stepped nearer. Each bloody handprint was a different size. One belonged to an adult. Another looked much smaller. Almost like a child's hand. Then Ethan noticed something even stranger. The smallest handprint wore a ring. A tiny silver ring on its little finger. His stomach tightened. Emily instinctively grabbed her own necklace. My grandmother, she whispered. No one understood what she meant until she pointed at the ring. My grandmother always wore a silver ring on her little finger. The chamber fell silent. Thomas slowly turned toward her. Is she alive? Emily nodded. Yes. Thomas closed his eyes. Then don't think about her. What? Whatever you do. Don't picture her face. Emily frowned in confusion, but it was already too late. The moment Thomas spoke those words, her grandmother's image flashed through her mind with perfect clarity. She remembered her warm smile, the gentle wrinkles around her eyes, the scent of lavender perfume she had worn for years, and the comforting sound of her voice reading bedtime stories when Emily was a child. The mind remembered too. A faint knocking echoed from inside the wall. 3 slow knocks. Everyone turned toward the sound. Knock. 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 The stone vibrated gently beneath their feet. Then a voice emerged from the solid rock. Soft. Fragile. My sweet Emily. Emily's face lost all color. No. It was impossible. She knew that voice. It belonged to her grandmother. My sweet girl. The voice sounded frightened now. I can't breathe. I'm trapped. Please. Help me. Emily's eyes filled with tears. Thomas stepped between her and the wall. Don't listen. But that's her. No. It isn't. You don't know my grandmother. Thomas looked directly into Emily's eyes. I know this mine. The knocking continued. This time it came faster. Knock. 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 Tiny cracks spread slowly across the stone wall where the smallest bloody handprint had appeared. Dust drifted into the air. Another knock. A small piece of rock broke loose and fell onto the ground. Behind the opening, there was darkness. Not ordinary darkness. Movement. Something was pressing against the other side. Emily instinctively stepped backward. The opening widened. A pale finger slowly emerged through the crack. Its skin looked human. Old. Wrinkled. Covered with coal dust. On its little finger rested a familiar silver ring. Emily screamed. The finger began scratching at the opening, trying to make the crack larger. Another finger appeared. Then another. Soon an entire hand pushed through the broken stone, desperately clawing at the edge of the opening. My darling? The voice was crying now. It hurts. Please pull me out. Emily covered her ears. No. No. Thomas grabbed her shoulders. Look at me. She couldn't. Her eyes remained fixed on the hand emerging from the wall. Every detail matched perfectly. The veins. The wrinkles. The silver ring. The tiny scar across the knuckle from an old kitchen accident. Everything. It was her grandmother's hand. Or something pretending to be. The hand stretched farther through the crack until a wrist became visible. Then part of an arm. The opening continued widening by itself. The sound of breaking stone echoed throughout the chamber. Dust rained from the ceiling. Thomas drew a slow breath. It has never come this far before. What does that mean? Ethan asked. The old miner never answered. Because another crack appeared. Not beside the first one. Across the room. Then another. And another. Soon the entire chamber was filled with the sound of stone splitting apart. Dozens of long fractures spread across every wall surrounding them. From behind each crack came different voices. Some cried. Some laughed. Some whispered prayers. Others begged desperately for help. The chamber became filled with hundreds of overlapping voices, each belonging to someone the teenagers loved. Parents. Brothers. Sisters. Children. Friends. Teachers. Every familiar voice echoed through the mine at once, creating a chorus so overwhelming that none of them could distinguish one from another. Then every voice stopped together. Complete silence returned. A deep rumble rolled beneath their feet. The ground shook harder than before. Chunks of coal fell from the ceiling as the mountain groaned around them. Thomas's expression turned grim. It's waking up. Ethan stared at him. What is? Thomas slowly lifted his flashlight and pointed it toward the endless darkness inside the main shaft. For several terrifying seconds, nothing happened. Then, 2 enormous eyes opened deep below. They were larger than truck tires. Neither human nor animal. Ancient. Patient. Watching. The eyes did not blink. They simply stared upward into the chamber. Straight at the 5 teenagers. Then, for the first time since Black Hollow Mine had swallowed them into its depths, the mountain itself spoke. In a voice so deep it seemed to rise from the center of the earth, it whispered only 6 words. The words did not echo. They lingered inside the teenagers' minds, as though the mountain itself had spoken directly into their thoughts. The enormous eyes at the bottom of the shaft remained fixed on them, unblinking and impossibly old. Every instinct screamed for them to run, yet none of them could move. It felt as if the darkness rising from the shaft had wrapped itself around their bodies, holding them in place. Thomas Whitaker took a slow step forward and removed his rusted miner's helmet. For the first time since they had met him, the fear in his face disappeared, replaced by quiet acceptance. "I understand now," he said softly. "It was never feeding on people." The others looked at him in confusion. "It was feeding on time." Thomas explained that everyone who disappeared inside Black Hollow Mine had not simply died. The entity beneath the mountain stole years, memories, and possible futures. Every victim left behind another version of themselves trapped somewhere between the past and the future, endlessly calling for help. That was why the teenagers had seen older versions of themselves at the bottom of the shaft. Those weren't ghosts. They were futures that would exist only if the mine succeeded in claiming them. "The only reason they're still down there," Thomas whispered, "is because you still have a chance to leave." The massive eyes slowly began to close, but the darkness surrounding them continued to rise like thick black smoke. The chamber trembled violently. Cracks spread across the walls, and ancient support beams groaned beneath the weight of the mountain. Black Hollow Mine was collapsing. Thomas turned toward Ethan and placed the old miner's identification tag into his hand. "When you reach the surface, destroy every path leading here. Don't let anyone find this place again." "What about you?" Ethan asked. Thomas smiled sadly. "I left this world a long time ago." Before anyone could stop him, Thomas walked toward the edge of the shaft. The darkness surged upward as if recognizing him. He looked back only once. "I've kept it asleep for nearly 80 years, he said. "Now it's my turn to finish what I started." With that, he stepped into the darkness. The moment he disappeared, an ear-splitting roar erupted from the depths of the mine. The ground shook so violently that everyone was thrown to the floor. The giant eyes vanished, replaced by a swirling void that seemed to collapse inward on itself. The voices that had haunted the tunnels cried out one final time before fading into silence. "Run!" Ethan shouted. The 5 teenagers sprinted through the collapsing tunnels, dodging falling rocks and splintering wooden beams. Behind them, the ancient mine groaned like a dying beast. Dust filled the air, making it difficult to breathe, while sections of the tunnel disappeared beneath tons of collapsing stone. None of them looked back. After what felt like an eternity, a faint gray light appeared ahead. The entrance. One by one, they stumbled out of the mine just as the mountainside gave way. With a deafening crash, the entrance collapsed beneath thousands of tons of rock, sealing Black Hollow Mine forever. The forest became silent once again. No voices. No footsteps. Only the sound of 5 terrified teenagers struggling to catch their breath beneath the morning sky. Days later, rescue teams searched the area but found no trace of another entrance. According to official records, there had never been a foreman named Thomas Whitaker assigned to Black Hollow Mine in 1948. Yet when Ethan finally examined the rusted identification tag in daylight, the engraved name was still there. A week later, he returned to the site alone. The collapsed entrance remained exactly as it had been. Before leaving, he nailed a new wooden sign to a nearby tree. It contained only 7 words. "Don't look into the mine shaft. Ever." Years passed. None of the 5 friends ever spoke publicly about what happened beneath Black Hollow. Ethan deleted every frame of video recorded inside the mine. Noah abandoned photography. Lucas never joked about ghost stories again. Maya moved away from West Virginia, and Emily refused to enter caves or tunnels for the rest of her life. They survived. But sometimes survival comes with a price. On quiet nights, just before falling asleep, each of them would occasionally hear the faint sound of someone crying in the distance. They never opened their windows. They never answered the voices. Because deep down, they all knew one terrible truth. Some places are not haunted because people died there. Some places are haunted because something beneath them is still waiting for the next person to look down. The end.